Sneak the soldiers through the pipes, and they'll be able to infiltrate cities. As crazy a strategy as that might sound, Russia has been using it for months in Ukraine, as it tries to capture Kupiansk. Russia's problem is that Ukraine knows about the pipeline that feeds into the city, and what you would expect to happen has been happening. Russia's secret pipeline invasion has backfired. The men in pipes are being taken out in droves as Ukraine unleashes a brutal response to Russia's stealthy invasion. According to United 24 media, Russia's situation in Kupiansk, which is in the Kharkiv region, grows more dire by the day. As of the outlet's January 20th report, there are believed to be fewer than 100 Russian soldiers left in the city, many of whom are crouched down in basements and other hidey holes as they await reinforcements that aren't coming. These soldiers are far more likely to be tracked down and destroyed by Ukraine's roaming drones, and there's a big reason why. Russia's only strategy for sneaking soldiers into Kupiansk has collapsed. For months now, Russia has been sending reinforcements into Kupiansk using old gas pipelines that run beneath the Oskil River in the direction of the city. The strategy worked for a while. Russia's soldiers crawled through about 15 kilometers or 9.3 miles of pipeline, sometimes using electric scooters to progress faster in the portions of the pipe where they could come close to standing. Also, they could come out the other end near Kupiansk. United 24 media reports that Ukraine first learned about Russia's use of the pipeline in the summer of 2025, though there wasn't much they could do about it at the time. Kupiansk was under siege. Ukraine seemed to be on the verge of losing the city as more Russian soldiers poured through the pipeline to get where they needed to be. Constantly attacked and in dire need of help, the city's defenders requested reinforcements urgently. In late September, those reinforcements arrived. And they changed the situation in Kupiansk so drastically that the city is a very different beast in January than it was in the summer. You'll learn more about the current situation in Kupiansk if you keep watching the video, but as for reinforcements, they set about launching a counteroffensive throughout the latter months of 2025, with the goal of clearing out the city that was becoming infested with small pockets of Russian soldiers. For such a clear-out to hold, Ukraine would also have to turn its attention to the pipeline Russia was using to sneak its soldiers in. It did just that in November, according to the Washington Post. Russia's pipeline strategy started to fall to pieces as a result of the Achilles brigade and its commander, Anton Shmiel. Deployed to Kupiansk, the brigade set about mapping the pipeline using plans made available to them, and they came up with an idea. Exits from the pipeline would have to be destroyed, along with any hiding places nearby that could be used by any Russian soldiers who still somehow made it through. They go by foot, coming out of the pipeline and running to find shelter in one of the forests nearby, Shmiel said of the Russian soldiers, adding that those who found shelter would often change into civilian clothes soon after. They would then load their rifles in their backpacks and attempt to infiltrate Kupiansk. In November, Shmiel put the first part of his plan to stop Russia's pipeline infiltrators into action. Drones were deployed to the pipeline, each carrying 33-pound bombs that were dropped over the underwater section of the pipe. The flooding that ensued blocked many of the pipeline's exits, leading to Russia being forced to revert to crossing the Oskil River using rafts once again. That made them easy targets for Ukraine's drones, though sadly, the situation wouldn't last long. But the Achilles brigade was at least able to revel in its victory for a while. On December 13th, the Kyiv Independent reported on a video published by the brigade that showcased how it had pulled off its pipeline attack. Lasting about 95 seconds, the video highlights the terrible conditions inside the pipelines and shows several examples of Russian soldiers emerging from the pipe's exits. Then the bombing starts. We see munitions being dropped and massive explosions taking out portions of the Kupiansk pipeline. Wherever the Achilles brigade identified an exit, a bomb would soon follow. The pressure on Kupiansk was relieved, but that relief would be short-lived. Unfortunately, and as the Washington Post reports Shmiel is stating, Russia began building new entrances and exits into the Oskil River pipeline, resulting in it sending yet more soldiers through it. Still, Ukraine had struck a major blow, both physically and psychologically. On the physical side, Russia had been deprived of the pipeline exits that it knew and understood, which disrupted the country's infiltration attempts. The psychological damage was likely worse. Now every Russian soldier who enters the pipeline knows that Ukraine knows what they're doing and could strike at any time. But right now, Ukraine isn't trying to destroy exits. Instead, it's presenting the Russian soldiers who emerge from pipelines and float over the Oskil River with special welcome presents as they arrive near Kupiansk. Those presents are drones, and they deliver death to any Russian soldier who attempts to infiltrate. Every day, Russian soldiers still try to increase their presence in the city, sending men across the river on inflatable rafts or through the empty gas pipeline that runs below it, the Washington Post says. Drone footage reviewed by the Post shows dead Russian soldiers scattered around pipeline exits and around the river itself. Now, all that Putin is achieving is the sending of his soldiers through a literal hell on earth, all in the hope of getting a handful of them into Kupiansk. And when we say hell on earth, we really mean it. The pipeline being used by Russia to sneak soldiers into Kupiansk isn't just tight and unwelcoming for adult men. It's a former gas pipeline, and that fact is having an impact. United 24 media reports that many of the soldiers who emerge from the pipeline exhibit signs of chemical poisoning, which only makes them easier targets for Ukraine's drones. Perhaps those who get poisoned are the lucky ones. At least they emerge and get to see the sky again before Ukraine's drones cut them down. When Russia was using the same tactic when trying to retake the portion of the Kursk region that it lost to Ukraine in 2024, the pipeline soldiers often didn't make it out to the other side. That was revealed on July 7th by the Telegram channel Severny Kanal, which published a video covering what Russia dubbed Operation Stream. One unnamed soldier in the video says that some of the men who went into the Kursk pipeline lost their minds and ended up taking their own lives rather than trying to push through to face an almost certain death on the other side. Bodies also piled up. Getting a cargo 200, military slang for a body, out of the pipe, that's a whole ordeal. There's just no room in there. Some of the corpses are still lying there. The ones stuck in the rubble. I heard them yelling, "What's going on?" My legs gave out, the soldier recounts. Add chemical poisoning into that mix and you get a strategy that seems more likely to result in death inside the pipe or out than it is to lead to the fall of Kupiansk. That brings us back nicely to the situation in Kupiansk right now. But before we dive into what's happening in Kupiansk, now that Russia's pipeline infiltrations have been shut down, we hope that you're enjoying this video. If you are, please give the video a like, subscribe to The Military Show, and leave a comment below telling us what you think about Russia's pipeline infiltrations. Back to Kupiansk, the reality on the ground that Putin now has to face is that a city he has claimed several times to have captured is very much in Ukraine's hands. And with Russia's failure to capture Kupiansk comes the loss of something very important to Putin. If you want to find out what that is, keep watching and we'll explain. Russia's presence in Kupiansk has been pulled back to the 100 or so soldiers that we mentioned earlier. That's a far cry from what we were seeing as recently as October. On the 21st of that month, the Center for Eastern Studies reported that Ukrainian sources were claiming that Russia had managed to take control over the center of Kupiansk as they made their way further south into the city. Groups of soldiers were actively trying to penetrate Ukraine's southern defenses, which would have allowed them to advance along the Oskil River in the direction of the Kupiansk-Vozlovyi railway junction. If that had happened, Ukraine's Kharkiv defenders would have had serious problems on their hands. That junction connects to a railway line that runs through Russia's Belgorod region, meaning the capture of Kupiansk would have allowed Russia to turn the city into a logistical node supplying troops as they advanced deeper into Kharkiv. All of this was according to the Kremlin's plan. Plans have changed due to the arrival of reinforcements and Ukraine's pipeline-busting troops into Kupiansk. What once seemed to be an overwhelming presence in Kupiansk has become the remnants of a military for which only a few stragglers remain. Ukraine, for its part, has spent the last few months approaching its Kupiansk counterattacks with ruthless efficiency. Russia is suffering casualties by the bucket load and it barely seems to be able to fire shots back at the Ukrainian soldiers who are taking out its country's troops. That was revealed in a January 16th report in The Independent, which claimed that Russia is now losing 27 of its soldiers for every Ukrainian loss in the Kupiansk direction. That assessment was shared at about the same time that it was revealed that Ukraine now controls about 90% of the city. It also highlights that when his plans fall to pieces, as we've seen with the pipeline, the only backup plan that Putin ever has is to create a meat grinder that results in massive Russian casualties. But this time the meat grinder isn't going to work. Ukraine is in such control of Kupiansk that it's able to hunt the few Russian soldiers down without worrying too much about reinforcements arriving. Those who try have to make it across the Oskil River by raft or pipeline, and Ukraine's drones are ensuring that isn't really possible. On January 13th, Ukraine's soldiers stormed into the very city center that they lost the previous October. There, they liberated the Kupiansk City Hall and raised the Ukrainian flag over a city that seemed almost destined to fall into Russia's hands. 6 days later, United 24 media published a report where it noted that Russian forces are continuing their efforts to infiltrate Kupiansk. However, the infiltration groups are small, and each one takes so many losses that the few survivors aren't able to gain footholds in the city. The chief of staff of the Cartier Brigade, Maxim Holubok, explains what it's like for his unit and the others that have spent the past few months liberating Kupiansk. It's like whack-a-mole, Holubok claims. We're holding a hammer and those moles keep popping up. However, the Washington Post says that clearing Kupiansk will likely take longer than Ukraine would want. That's what happens when Russia's strategy has devolved into sneaking handfuls of soldiers in and having them hide until they're found and killed. Russia's soldiers can hide in basements, under stairs, and in whatever crevices they find, which means clearing the last remaining infiltrators has to be a deliberate process, involving reconnaissance drones and a slow and steady approach. But Russia isn't able to move heavy equipment into the city, and those who try to enter are being restricted to operations within about 1 square kilometer of Kupiansk. That's obviously an extensive and notable victory, a drone unit commander named Vitaly tells the Washington Post. It's also a victory that Putin is attempting to minimize. Even as Russia's soldiers slowly die in Kupiansk, the Kremlin is trying to bluff about the level of control that its soldiers have over the city. Even on January 17th, RBC Ukraine was reporting that analysts from the Institute for the Study of War, or ISW, were pointing out that Russia's commanders are trying to claim that their forces control all of Kupiansk's districts, even as the evidence mounts that Russia barely has a presence in the city. Russian Defense Minister Andrei Belousov inspected the Russian Western grouping of forces on January 16th and heard reports from the grouping commander, Colonel General Sergei Kozlovlev, the ISW reports, before adding, Kozlovlev claimed that Russian forces in the Kupiansk direction seized Kucherivka, east of Kupiansk, Podoli, and Kurilivka, both southeast of Kupiansk, in December 2025. The claim of supposed encirclement was accompanied by Kozlovlev telling Belousov that Ukraine had been unsuccessful in its efforts to break through in the city, and that Russia still maintained full control. Was this a lie by a commander who is terrified of being targeted by the wrath of Putin for his failure? Perhaps. But that lie is one that the Kremlin is more than happy to go along with because it stands to lose something huge if the truth about Kupiansk is revealed. We mentioned this huge loss earlier in the video, and it's something that Putin and his cronies value far more than the Russian lives that are being lost in ill-fated pipeline assaults. Bargaining power. Among the many reasons why Putin so desperately wants his forces to claim Kupiansk is that he wants to claim Ukraine's Donbas region. That may seem like a strange claim to make. Kupiansk is in Kharkiv, which isn't part of the Donbas, so the claiming of this city does nothing for Putin in terms of adding to the territory that Russia already occupies in the Donbas. However, there are links between Kupiansk and the Donbas region that explain why Russia keeps sending its soldiers through pipes to hopelessly attack. One of those links is the bargaining power we just mentioned. If Russia holds Kupiansk, it has a large Ukrainian settlement that it could potentially trade for territory elsewhere. Imagine a situation where Putin offers to return Kupiansk to Ukraine in return for the Donetsk-based city of Pokrovsk, or another of Ukraine's fortress belt cities in that oblast. Ukraine likely wouldn't take that trade. However, there are others, such as the United States, that might hear such an offer and feel that it's reasonable in the context of peace discussions. Russia would be giving something to get something back, a deal of sorts, one that would give Putin what he really wants, which is more territory in the Donbas. There are more practical reasons why Russia wants Kupiansk beyond using the city as leverage. Earlier we mentioned the railway junction that Russia could use to transport troops and equipment from Belgorod into Kupiansk. However, there's another link to the Donbas here. Back in September, RBC Ukraine reported that Russia would likely use Kupiansk as a logistical node not for further advances into Kharkiv, but to place even more pressure on the Donbas region. Pavlo Narozhny, who is a military expert, according to RBC Ukraine, explains what the fall of Kupiansk could mean in the fight for the Donbas. Capturing Kupiansk would severely worsen our logistics and greatly improve theirs. The entire war is about logistics. They will cut our routes and improve their own. Kupiansk is located at the rear of our defenders. It's far from Kharkiv, but the capture of the city poses a greater threat to the defenders of Donbas, the Slovyansk and Kramatorsk agglomerations, Narozhny claims. In other words, Russia would look to launch attacks from both sides against the Donetsk fortress belt if it captures Kupiansk. Troops that Putin hopes will eventually overrun Pokrovsk and advance will come from one side as soldiers from the Kupiansk direction attack from the other. That isn't going to happen anymore. Ukraine has made sure of that. Still, Russia pushes its soldiers through a pipeline that it knows Ukraine is monitoring. Adding to all that we've just mentioned, Putin's push for Kupiansk could also serve as more proof that Russia is interested in far more than the Donbas region. As the Washington Post notes, Moscow is expending resources and manpower to try and take the city that could be better served in the Donbas campaign, especially now that Ukraine has re-established control. Putin is doing that because his true war aims may extend far beyond the Donbas, the outlet suggests, and that the focus on the Donbas seen in peace talks up until this point could just be a smokescreen intended to hide Russia's true goal. Assuming that Putin wants to use Kupiansk as a bargaining chip, the situation in the city has put him in a desperate position. And just a few days ago, a few cracks appeared in Putin's facade that suggest he understands how powerful his loss of Kupiansk leverage has been. On January 15th, the Moscow Times reported that Putin claimed that Russia was ready to restore diplomatic relations with Europe to the condition that they were in before he launched his invasion. One would like to believe that over time, the situation will nonetheless change. and our states will return to normal, constructive dialogue, Putin said when welcoming new foreign ambassadors to Russia during a ceremony at the Kremlin. He added, "Russia was and remains committed to precisely these approaches and is ready to restore the level of relations we require. Our relations have deep historical roots, full of examples of mutually beneficial partnership and mutually enriching cultural cooperation." Those comments came in the wake of Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni claiming that it was time for the European Union to resume high-level dialogue with Russia, and those remarks couldn't have come at a better time for Putin. What we see in those comments is an opportunist making a desperate attempt to schmooze his way back into discussions with European leaders, whom he may believe he'll be able to manipulate into believing his version of events in places like Kupiansk. Putin may even be right about some European leaders, but most remain committed to Ukraine and to achieving a version of peace that doesn't leave the country as a weakened husk of itself, just waiting for Putin to relaunch his invasion. Kupiansk is controlled by Ukraine once more, and that means a massive bargaining chip has been taken away from Putin. His only response is to send soldiers through a pipeline of death that Ukraine has had scouted for months. We've touched on the Donbass several times in this video, and there's a narrative surrounding that region that is just as false as the one that Russia has spread about Kupiansk. There may be no pipeline involved in cities like Pokrovsk, but what is in the Donbass are false flags, lies, and blusters designed to hide Russia's mounting losses and constant failures. Find out all about what Ukraine has done in the Donbass in our video. And remember to subscribe to the Military Show for more coverage of the Kupiansk situation as it develops. And thank you for watching.